Psalms 105:15 says, touch not my anointed rather, and do my prophets no harm. Normally, this means that God's chosen people, particularly those who are serving as messengers of God's word, should not be harmed or mistreated. Does this mean even when they do harm and also mistreat? Tracy has the story. Tracy?
In another horrifying series of events from religious institutions, which we seem to never be in a shortage of recent finding, an Australian Russian Orthodox priest named Alexis Rosenthal has been found guilty of the sexual assault of 2 men and a child. Following the release of this information, and in a press release which I read as a bit detached, the Russian Orthodox Church apologized. And on Sunday, July the 6th, a high priest at the offender's former church warned his flock not to judge the priest, as sheep do not judge the shepherd, and to judge a priest is to judge their God himself. He uses his God as an instrument in fear, saying that to condemn is pride, and pride is one of the greatest sins. If condemnation is a sin, then their God must be the greatest sinner of all. This story is from The Friendly Atheist by Hemant Mehta on July 9th, 2025.
This is shit, Internet. Apologists, say. Which is unfortunate. And I want to ask you, Tracy, if you can kind of go a little bit deeper into this particular story, if you can, basically what led to said events, and also to lead said priest to tell basically the sheep, which are the dumb congregants, because sheep are one of the most dumbest animals that walk the face of this earth, to basically say nada about the prophet, hence, or the shepherd, even in his wrongdoing.
So I don't really know what led up to them finding out about all this. I understand that there were some documents found about a former conclave or project that he had been in, the Holy Transfiguration Monastery of Bombala. And he had this really messed up list of rules and regulations and mission statements for it. I can pull up a couple examples here. Fear the abbot as your Lord and love him as your father. When you are abused, be quiet, offend no one, and when you are offended, bear it patiently. Put no hope in vain plans and dreams. And then it goes on like this massive rant about how women are evil and will suck away your virtue with their venom. And it's really quite insane. I'm not 100%, but I believe that this was it that the turning up of this document was what had caused them to turn against him in the first place? Or am I just off base entirely there?
No, I think the condemnation of the priest was what they were talking about the congregation, and that's when the priest officiating that day said, "Do not judge him because he was one of our parishioners. He was the priest at this congregation at the time." And then the article talks about this other congregation that Rosenthal created between the time of the events he was charged for and the time he was charged. So all this is on the span of almost 20 years. But yeah, you mentioned the the passage about women. I'd like to read it to you because it's quite entertaining. Well, in a way, it says, and I quote, "The gaze of a woman is like a poison arrow, wounding the soul unto death. It is better to jump into a raging fire than to draw near to a young woman. Especially when you are young, avoid discourse with women if you hope to curb your bodily lusts. The beautiful face is more destructive than thunder and lightning." So that's what happens
Preach.
when, yeah, that's
You,
what happens when you prevent men from having a normal sexuality, then they develop an abnormal one, and that's
I
what you
don't.
end up with.
I don't know, Cindy. I think this kind of like leads to like some incels that we see like on the interwebs, like, you know, because they talk like this, right? And I don't know, Cindy, when you last looked at yourself in the mirror, did you think of nothing but destructive thundering and lightning?
I wish. I wish.
Me too.
Yeah,
I tell
yeah.
you. I tell you, I think that we would get our way with like all the time if we like, you know what? If you don't pay us equally, guess what? Thunder and lightning, bitch.
Yeah, that's
But you know, but Cindy, I did want to ask you because, like, you mentioned in your notes about this article actually containing two parts. Can you explain what you meant about that?
yeah. The first of the first part of the article is the let me put it back. So the Archbishop, what's his name?
George Schaefer.
Yes, that's him. And he's officiating after the conviction of Alexei Rosenthal, who was a member of this parish, and he says, "Do not judge him because you are sheep and he's a shepherd." And so Hemant Mehta, he worked, he researched Alexei Rosenthal to know more about him, and that's where the second part of the article comes, and the information about his congregation, where he was the leader and there were only women in there. So yeah, that's the two parts of the article. Rosenthal was sentenced to 10 months in prison for raping two men and a child. So I'm just putting this
10
just over there.
months.
Just 10 months, yes.
Yeah.
10 months. Because that speaks justice. 10 months actually doing, you know, certain things to particular people.
Three instances of sexual
Yeah.
battery.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, you know, should we say that, well, I guess because of the way that they looked at women, that's the reason why they did it to two men and a child instead? I don't know. It's let me grab my thoughts here because I have so many. But before I actually go into all of that, Tracy, I want you to, if you could just answer this question.
Yeah.
What are the dangers of equating criticisms of clergy with blasphemy? And how does that belief silence victims and enable the actual perpetrators?
I think you can see very clearly the dangers of questioning your clergy and equating questioning your clergy with blasphemy in the story of history as we've seen it over and over again. The divine right of kings led to some very, very horrible situations, wars, horrible living situations, and laws and societies set up this, the entire feudal system as a whole largely came from like this divine right, this thing that I will not be questioned because my will is the will of God. If you allow, I mean, the old adage, of course, will always ring true that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it will happen like that, as clearly happened. This man was handed an amount of power that he clearly could not control, clearly did not have the ability to to use well, and he used it to harm others. This is one of the most obvious ways we can see that conflating those two things is extremely dangerous, and it's one of the reasons that I find religious thinking to be so dangerous, because it isn't too long ago that, and it is still kind of the case in some places, that questioning even just your preacher is tantamount to blasphemy, and it's a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, I can think of so many different instances when I was attached to a more strict church institution, where basically the leader, the pastor, the prophet, the apostle, the angel of the house, as whatever type of moniker you want to assign, was basically giving absolution, like the Pope, regardless of what they said, they did, or or even like whatever type of possible harm that they could cause on another person. Now, I can't really say in my personal experience that I knew specifically of pastors, ministers, or even priests when I was part of, a more Roman Catholic, or even like little C Catholic. That's what the Episcopals were. As far as like, doing abuse. But of course, like, being part of this particular institution of the ACA and talking about these stories, we talk about, SA a lot when it comes to the church. It is not just the Catholic Church, right? And unfortunately, there's this idea that's not just in the Catholic Church, obviously, that the leadership should not be held accountable for some of the horrible things that they do to the more vulnerable populations of their congregation. And it's always, in some particular cases, children or young people. Like I don't know how old the two men were who were assaulted, but if someone can actually find it in an article, that'd be great. But
it doesn't say in the article, but I'll look elsewhere.
Okay, but we do know that it was a child, and unfortunately, we have way too many cases where children are the victims of people who are in authority that we're supposed to look up to be infallible, and they're supposed to be anointed men of God or whatever, that we're supposed to look at them and feel and should feel some type of safety. But unfortunately, that's not the case. I remember, guys, my 7th and 8th grade teacher for my parochial school, Roman Catholic parochial school, unfriended me on Facebook because I put up a meme that said that more children were harmed in church than at drag queen shows. And he decided to scold me because I decided to do it on Holy Week right before Easter. And then I only replied to him one sentence. That was a question. I said to my teacher, "Where's the lie?" Next thing you know, that I was unfriended. But that's the thing. Like, we constantly are covering these stories, and we're constantly covering children and men and women and victims after victim after victim when it comes to, and then we're supposed to keep silence about this. Like, the congregation can't talk about it. People on the outside should not talk about it. And, but we want to demonize and, scapegoat to the queer community as far as like they're being predators, but they're not the predators. they're not. They're not the predators. I'm not, and
They're not.
they're not.
But
They're
it's the
not the
same.
predators.
It's the
Yeah, go
same
ahead,
thing that
Tracy.
bad guys have been. I'm sorry, but it's the same thing
Yeah.
that bad guys in politics have been doing forever. Is just pointing at a small group of people and saying, "You see those people over there? They're doing everything that you're afraid people are doing."
Yeah.
And it's
what, living your life and not necessarily having to ask permission in order for you to be happy, for you to be able to actually, you know, live the truth of who you are to you. You know, I mean, like, and again, this just goes back to this whole thing about, like, if you want to see control, this is what the control looks like. Cindy, you know, talk about evidence. Like, if you want evidence about religion, what's that look like?
You know, there's while I was listening to you, there's something that I've been trying to explain for a little while, and we talked about teaching critical thinking in school, and so when we are children, we are wired to listen to authority, to our parents, right? And religion relies heavily on this. That's why they teach religion to kids, because they mistake this religious authority to parental authority. To children, it's the same. So, on the other hand, when we talk about science, we rely on the words and the studies and all that from people, and we use them as source of knowledge. And so most people don't understand the difference between the two. And teaching critical thinking is crucial, because we need to be able to live in a society where we can make the difference between the two. Because this week, while we're recording this, there's a big issue on the US government with this Epstein client list. Does it exist? Does it not? You shouldn't listen to it, etc., etc. And because so many people listened to one man in position of authority and believed what he said and didn't apply critical thinking, and now I don't know. I don't know how to explain this difference to people. But someone needs to.
Well, you know, because like here in the Estados Unidos and in other places where, you know, religion, or even like, you know, when you have regimes over you that do not allow or discourage critical thinking and skepticism, unfortunately, you have a vast array of misinformation and misdirection to happen to get into the fray, you know, and people start who happen to be, you know, in the electorate are, you know, propagandized to death, and to the point where we're at the area of, you know, between not necessarily knowing what is fact and what is not, because we're basically being told that, hey, this whole thing right here where the evidence looks like that this is actually a thing, we're propagandized to say this is not a thing, right? And unfortunately, we had a very long history due to, you know, religion being so intertwined with how our society has grown, even though that, you know, the United States is not an old country. We're like, what, 249 years old? And
something like that.
yeah. And I mean, even though the founders, like, made it a point when in the very first amendment to do the establishment clause to separate church and state, religion and government, because they saw in Europe how when, church gets involved with government, all types of, bad crap happens, right? But unfortunately, we still had people who ended up getting into the government who don't want that, right? We have sitting Congress people now saying they don't believe in the separation of religion and government crap, coming out of their mouths as they are talking to other, religious and religion institutions, right? And this is what we're fighting against now. So when we are looking at instances like this story where people are clearly being harmed, and just to go on like a small rant, one of the things that really grinds my gears is when I am talking to Christians specifically who will confront you as a person who happens to be secular, non-believer, agnostic, atheist, whatever you decide you're going to call yourself. And you mentioned a instance or several instances where there was actual harm that came from the top down from a religious institution, and they say, oh, you left because a church hurt, and you're not supposed to leave because a church hurt, because you're supposed to look at God and not the man. I said, well, baby girl, how in the hell am I supposed to separate the two if I am taught that the man that's standing in front of me is a representation of God? Make that make sense. So now we are here at these crossroads, and we are constantly being bombarded with, look over there at the bush, even though it's on fire. Oh, no, don't look at the bush that's on fire. Look over here. Okay? I mean, like, what do you want us to do? Okay? It has to be to the point where we are saying, listen, we cannot allow ourselves to keep silent when we are seeing people doing harm to the least of us. We cannot allow, just because a person happens to have a religious leadership position, to get away without being accountable when they are doing harm to people. And you cannot continuously gaslight people into, if they are leaving religion and they're leaving these institutions and they're leaving belief systems and they're wanting to lean more to skepticism and critical thinking and actually gaining knowledge through using empirical evidence rather than wishful thinking, not to demonize them because that's what they decide to do, because it's obvious that we've been doing this belief faith crap all this time and it's not working for us. It's not.
Amen.
Not at all. Not at all.
And on that note, guys, if you want to hear more rants from us, click here.